The soft hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin of Flight 472, creating a calming white noise that blended with the clinks of glassware and the rustle of newspapers. The polished wood accents, cream leather seats, and subtle scent of luxury perfumes crafted an atmosphere of wealth and exclusivity. This was the world where Mira Rowan thrived, a world of silent judgments, unspoken hierarchies, and polished facades. Mira moved down the aisle with the grace of someone who had done this for years. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, and her smile rehearsed to the point of perfection. Every step was calculated, every glance assessed. She knew who the frequent flyers were, who tipped generously, and who expected extra attention. But more importantly, she knew who didn't. Her eyes flicked to the front of the cabin as a new couple boarded. An elderly black man in a neatly pressed navy suit, his hand gently holding that of a woman in an elegant cream-colored dress. Edric and Leora Whitmore walked slowly, with the kind of grace that came not just from age, but from dignity. Their fingers were intertwined, a small gesture that spoke volumes about their bond. But to Mira, they didn't fit the mold. Probably saved up for this flight, she thought, her practiced smile never wavering. Maybe a retirement gift or a one-time splurge. She didn't think twice about it. She had made hundreds of these silent judgments before. It was part of the job, wasn't it? Edric and Leora settled into seats 2A and 2B. Leora's face looked a bit pale, her movement slower than usual. The long layovers had taken a toll on her, and the recycled air of the cabin didn't help. Edric noticed her discomfort. "Feeling all right, my love?" he asked softly. She offered a weak smile, just a bit dehydrated. Edric reached for the call button, the soft chime echoing in the cabin. Mira, who had been arranging drinks in the galley, responded swiftly. She approached with her polished smile. "Yes, sir, how may I assist you?" Edric's tone was gentle, polite. "Could I get a glass of water for my wife? She's feeling a little unwell." There was a beat, a pause so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but it echoed loudly in Mira's mind. She hesitated. "Water will be served with the meal service," she replied, her tone still professional but laced with a dismissiveness she didn't even register. Edric raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained calm. "I understand, but she's feeling a bit dehydrated. Just a small glass, if it's no trouble." Mira's smile faltered for the briefest second before she masked it again. "I'm sorry, sir. It's against protocol. We have a schedule for a reason." The words hung in the air. Around them, a few nearby passengers subtly turned their heads, pretending not to listen but catching every word. A businessman in 1C sipped his champagne, his eyes flickering toward the couple, curiosity piqued. Edric sighed softly, the disappointment evident in his eyes but not in his voice. "Very well, thank you." Mira nodded curtly and walked away, her mind already moving on to the next task. She didn't give the exchange a second thought. But someone else did. The gentle hum of the engines echoed through the first-class cabin, but beneath the calm exterior, a storm was brewing, one no one could yet see. Mira Rowan stood in the galley, refilling champagne glasses and arranging a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Her hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding her through years of first-class service. But her mind lingered on the exchange with the elderly couple. "They didn't seem that upset," she rationalized. "It's just water, not the end of the world." She had dismissed Edric's request with a polite but firm refusal, as she'd done countless times when passengers tried to bend the rules. Yet something about the interaction gnawed at her like a splinter she couldn't ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Mira?" Sienna Hale whispered, standing awkwardly by the galley's edge. Mira glanced up. "Yes?" Sienna hesitated. She was new to first class, eager to learn but cautious not to step on any toes, especially Mira's. Still, what she'd witnessed earlier didn't sit right. "I was just wondering," Sienna's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her uniform, "about that couple in 2A and 2B. The woman didn't look well. Maybe we could—" Mira's eyes hardened. "Sienna, if you want to last in first class, you need to stop second-guessing how things are done." Sienna's cheeks flushed, but she bit her tongue. She wanted to argue, to say that sometimes compassion mattered more than protocol, but the words stuck in her throat. She had seen the subtle hierarchy in action, how certain passengers were treated with warmth and others with cool indifference. She didn't want to rock the boat. Mira, sensing Sienna's internal conflict, softened her tone slightly. It's not about being heartless. It's about maintaining order. If we start making exceptions, it sets a precedent. Sienna nodded, but the discomfort lingered. Was that really all this was about? Meanwhile, in seat 2A, Edric Whitmore sat silently, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Leora had leaned back, her eyes closed, trying to rest despite the dryness in her throat and the heaviness in her chest. Edric's gaze was calm, but his mind was working. He had seen it all, the quick glance Mira had given them, the split-sec judgment in her eyes, the dismissiveness masked behind a professional smile. It wasn't the first time he and Leora had encountered this kind of treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But today something felt different. Reaching into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, Edric pulled out his phone. With slow, deliberate taps, he composed a message. Incident in first class, flight 472. Requesting executive oversight. He hit send. Leora stirred beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. You sent the message, didn't you? Edric smiled faintly. Yes. She opened her eyes, studying his face. You're not angry? Edric shook his head. No. Disappointed, maybe. But I've learned anger doesn't fix these things. Leora exhaled softly. She understood. They had spent decades building their empire, from humble beginnings to owning one of the largest airlines in the country. They knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, and they had used those experiences to fuel their rise. But still, the sting of moments like these never fully dulled. In the galley, Mira busied herself, trying to shake off the unease creeping into her thoughts. She poured a glass of chilled water, not for Leora, of course, but for the businessman in 1C who had requested it moments earlier. She handed it to him with a warm smile, even placing a neatly folded napkin beneath the glass. The man nodded without looking up from his tablet. Thanks. Mira's smile lingered as she walked away, but Sienna, watching from the galley, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She'd just told Edric no, but brought him water without a second thought, Sienna wondered. It wasn't about the rules. It was about who the rules were bent for, and who they weren't. Back in seat 2A, Edric observed the exchange between Mira and the businessman. He noticed the ease with which she had served him. No hesitation, no excuses, just service. His jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. Leora opened her eyes again. She doesn't know who we are, does she? Edric chuckled softly. Not yet. There was a power in anonymity, in watching people reveal who they truly were when they didn't know they were being watched. Edric had learned this lesson well over the years. It was why he often travelled without making a fuss, preferring to observe rather than announce his presence. Moments like these revealed more about people than any interview or resume ever could. In the cockpit, a soft chime echoed. Captain Roland Vance glanced at the screen. A priority message had come through. He read it twice, his brow furrowing. Executive oversight requested, incident in first class involving service denial to high-profile passengers. Vance's eyes widened slightly as he read the names attached to the message, Edric and Leora Whitmore. He straightened in his seat, understanding the gravity of the situation. He reached for the intercom and pressed the button. Mr. Rowan, please report to the cockpit. Mira, who had been straightening napkins on a tray, flinched at the call. It was rare to be summoned mid. Sienna's eyes met hers. Everything okay? I'm sure it's nothing, Mira replied, though her voice betrayed a flicker of nervousness. She made her way toward the cockpit, her mind racing with possibilities. Was there a security issue, a change in flight plans? She knocked gently before entering. Captain Vance turned in his seat, his expression serious. Miss Rowan, do you know who's seated in 2A and 2B? Mira blinked, caught off guard by the question. An elderly couple. I believe their names are Edric and Leora Whitmore. The captain's voice was cold. "Do you know who they are?" Mira hesitated. "No, sir." Vance exhaled sharply. "They own the airline." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Her heart pounded, her mind racing back to the moment she had dismissed Edric's simple request. I didn't know," she stammered. The captain's gaze didn't soften. "That's the problem." He handed her a sheet of paper. "You're to return to their seats and correct your mistake. Upon landing, you'll be reporting to the executive board for review." Mira's hands trembled as she took the paper. "Yes, Captain." As she turned to leave, Vance added, "And Mira, they didn't ask for any of this. They didn't report you. This is all coming from the top." The weight of those words sank deep. As Mira made her way back to the first-class cabin, her mind swirled with panic, regret, and fear. The whispers of the passengers felt louder now, though she wasn't sure if they were actually speaking, or if it was just the noise in her head. She approached seats 2A and 2B, where Edric and Leora sat calmly. Too calmly, she thought. She crouched slightly, her voice shaking. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to offer my deepest apologies. There was a misunderstanding earlier. May I offer you some refreshments now?" Edric turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "A misunderstanding?" Mira's throat went dry. "Yes, sir. I didn't realize that we were important." Edric's voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. Leora, her tone softer but equally firm, added, "You didn't hesitate to serve others. Why did you hesitate with us?" Passengers nearby subtly leaned closer, pretending not to listen while hanging on to every word. Mira had no answer. "I'm truly sorry," she whispered. Edric leaned back, his expression unreadable. "It was never about the water, Ms. Rowan. It was about the choice you made." The words echoed in her mind long after she had walked away. The hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin, but now it carried a different weight. There was a stillness in the air, heavy, almost suffocating, as though everyone sensed something was about to happen, but no one dared speak it aloud. Mira Rowan returned to the galley, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to appear composed. The short conversation with Edric and Leora Whitmore had left her rattled. Their words, calm, deliberate, yet filled with meaning, echoed in her mind. "It was never about the water, Miss Rowan. It was about the choice you made." She reached for a tray, her fingers fumbling as she placed wineglasses onto it. The clink of glass against glass sounded louder than usual. Every movement, every noise felt amplified. From the corner of her eye she noticed Sienna Hale watching her. "Mira?" Sienna's voice was soft, but it carried a nervous edge. "Is everything okay? You seem off." Mira forced a tight-lipped smile. "Everything's fine." But Sienna wasn't convinced. She'd seen the way Mira had returned from the cockpit, pale, shaken, and she had witnessed the forced apology to the Whitmores. Something big was unfolding, and Sienna felt the tension crawling up her spine. She hesitated, then spoke again. I know it's not my place, but I think what happened with the Whitmores." Mira's composure cracked, if only for a second. "Don't, Sienna. Just don't." The junior attendant fell silent, but the pit in her stomach grew. She could feel it. The shift in the cabin, the whispers, the glances. Something was about to happen. Meanwhile, Edric and Leora Whitmore sat quietly in their seats. To the untrained eye, they appeared calm, unbothered, just another couple enjoying their first-class flight. But Edric's mind was racing. He had built Whitmore Airlines from the ground up, starting with a single-prop plane and a vision. Over the decades, he'd encountered all forms of prejudice, bias, and dismissiveness. It had shaped him, hardened him in some ways, but it had also taught him patience. Moments like these, where someone's true character revealed itself, were powerful. Leora placed her hand gently on his. "You're handling this well." Edric smiled faintly. "It's not the first time." She squeezed his hand. "I know, but it never gets easier, does it?" He shook his head. No, but this time, there's an opportunity here. She raised an eyebrow. To make an example? To make a change, he replied. He picked up his phone, sending another discreet message to the executive team. Ensure a full review. No immediate confrontation. Let her reveal herself. Edric wanted this to play out, not out of spite or revenge, but because real change didn't happen through anger. It happened through exposure, through letting the truth surface on its own. In the galley, Mira busied herself with trivial tasks, hoping the minutes would pass faster, but the seconds dragged, each one heavier than the last. The call from the cockpit, the knowledge that she'd dismissed the owners of the airline, it gnawed at her. I didn't know, she kept repeating to herself. If I'd known, I wouldn't have. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't about who Edric and Leora were. It was about how she saw them, or rather, how she didn't see them. She had made a judgment based on appearance, without a second thought. Her internal spiral was interrupted when the intercom buzzed again. Ms. Rowan, please report to the cockpit. Her stomach twisted into knots. Sienna looked at her, eyes wide. Again? Mira forced a nod and made her way toward the front, her heart pounding harder with each step. Inside the cockpit, Captain Vance didn't look up as Mira entered. I've been informed, he began, his voice measured, that the executive team has decided to escalate this incident. Mira's throat went dry. Escalate? He finally turned to face her. Upon landing, you're to be escorted off the plane by security. There will be a disciplinary review. Mira's knees felt weak. Security? That seems... The captain's eyes didn't waver. They want to make this formal. A beat of silence. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, You know, Mira, they didn't report you. The Whitmores. They didn't make a scene, but they didn't have to. The weight of his words settled like a stone in her chest. As Mira returned to the cabin, her vision blurred slightly. The soft chatter of passengers, the clinking of glasses, it all felt distant, muted. She passed by Edric and Leora's seats, trying not to make eye contact, but she could feel Edric's gaze on her, calm, unjudging, but heavy with meaning. Nearby passengers were starting to notice. They whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances. First class wasn't as discreet as it pretended to be. Sienna approached her cautiously. Mira, what's happening? Mira's facade finally cracked. Her voice was barely a whisper. They're escorting me off the plane when we land. Sienna's eyes widened. What? Why? Mira didn't answer. She couldn't. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of regret, fear, and anger. Not just at the situation, but at herself. Back in 2A, Edric received another message from his executive team. Confirmed. Security will escort her off upon landing. Full disciplinary review scheduled. He read it, then placed the phone down. Leora glanced at him. Is this what you wanted? He considered the question. It's not about what I want. It's about what's right. She nodded, understanding. Do you think she's learned anything from this? Leora asked. Edric sighed. I don't know, but I hope she does. They both knew that the impact of this moment wouldn't just affect Mira, it would ripple through the entire company, forcing a conversation about how biases, even subtle ones, dictated treatment. The plane began its descent. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening seatbelts, preparing for landing. But the calm routine felt disrupted, like everyone could sense the tension in the air. Mira stood at the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She watched as the runway appeared beneath them, growing closer with each passing second. Sienna stood nearby, awkward and silent. Mira, she finally whispered, I'm sorry this is happening. Mira didn't respond, because deep down she knew this wasn't something that was happening to her, it was something she had done to herself. As the plane touched down, the wheels screeching against the tarmac, a thought crossed her mind, one she hadn't dared to face before. If they hadn't been the owners, would I have ever felt guilty? The plane touched down with a soft jolt, tires screeching against the tarmac before easing into a smooth taxi. The familiar announcement rang through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York City. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We hope you enjoyed your flight with Whitmore Airlines." But there was little relief in the first-class cabin. A tense hush hung in the air, as if everyone sensed something unusual was unfolding. Mira Rowan stood at the front of the cabin, her hands clenched tightly around the back of her seat, knuckles pale. She felt the weight of countless eyes on her, even though most passengers tried to avoid obvious stares. The businessman in 1C adjusted his tie, stealing a glance. A woman a few rows back whispered into her husband's ear. The murmur spread like ripples on still water. Mira's heart raced. Her uniform, once a badge of authority and control, now felt suffocating, like a heavy cloak she couldn't remove. Security escorted off the plane. A disciplinary review. The captain's words echoed in her mind, growing louder with every passing second. Sienna Hale stood at the galley, awkward and uncertain. She had been watching Mira unravel over the last hour, caught between wanting to help and knowing there was nothing she could do. Her heart ached with pity, but also with a deep discomfort at what had transpired. She had seen it after all. The casual dismissal of the Whitmore's request, the ease with which Mira had poured water for other passengers, and the subtle but undeniable shift in the cabin's mood when Mira's actions became obvious. Sienna hesitated before speaking. "Mira, is there anything I can do?" Mira barely acknowledged her, her mind lost in spiraling thoughts. "No, just focus on the passengers." Sienna nodded but remained nearby. Part of her wanted to stay close, if only to bear witness to what would happen next. In seat 2A, Edric Whitmore sat calmly, his hands resting on his lap. He glanced around the cabin, noting the unease, the curiosity, the way people subtly turned to look at him and Leora, trying to piece together what was happening. Leora reached for his hand. "They know something's going on." Edric smiled faintly. "Let them. It's not about spectacle, but sometimes change needs an audience." She tilted her head. "You really think this will lead to change?" He considered that. "Maybe. Or at least it will start a conversation." He glanced at Mira, standing stiffly at the front. Her shoulders were hunched, her composure fractured, but even now she tried to hold on to some semblance of control. The intercom chimed again, and the captain's voice came through, calmer but with a subtle authority. "Cabin crew, doors to arrival and cross-check. Ms. Rowan, please remain on board until further notice." The words echoed through the cabin. Mira's stomach twisted. Passengers turned now, some openly staring. A few tried to look indifferent, but their curiosity was palpable. Something was happening, something rare enough to break through the polished veneer of first-class decorum. Mira swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe evenly. She could see the two security officers waiting just outside the front door of the plane, visible through the small oval window. Their presence felt like a physical weight, anchoring her in place. Sienna, standing behind Mira, couldn't take it anymore. "Mira, I don't understand. Why security? You didn't... this wasn't..." Mira turned sharply, her eyes wild for a moment. I didn't... What? Mistreat them? Discriminate?" Sienna flinched at the sharpness in her voice, but didn't back down. I saw what happened, but..." "But what?" Mira hissed, her voice low but intense. "I didn't know who they were. I didn't know they owned the damn airline." There it was, the truth spilled out, raw and exposed. Sienna's eyes widened, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "You didn't need to know who we were." It was Edric. He had stood up from his seat, his presence calm yet commanding. Every passenger turned toward him now, their curiosity piquing. "You didn't need to know our names or our titles," Edric continued, his voice even but filled with quiet authority. "You just needed to treat us like people." His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Mira's breath caught. Her throat tightened as though invisible hands were choking the air from her lungs. There was nothing she could say, no excuse that would make sense. Leora rose from her seat, her movements graceful but deliberate. She stood beside Edric, her gaze soft but unwavering. "You see," she added gently, "it wasn't about the water. It was about how easily you decided we didn't belong here, that our request wasn't worth your time." Mira's eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Her hands trembled at her sides. "I didn't mean," she started, but the words felt hollow even as they left her mouth. Edric raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "We don't need an explanation. We've heard them all before." The cabin was silent now, the tension thick enough to choke on. No one moved. No one spoke. For Mira, the walls felt like they were closing in. The front door of the plane opened with a mechanical hiss, and the two security officers stepped inside. They approached Mira, their movements calm and professional. One of them spoke quietly, but his words echoed in her ears. "Ms. Rowan, please, come with us." It was surreal, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Mira looked around the cabin one last time, seeing the faces of the passengers, some sympathetic, others judgmental, most simply watching with fascination. She saw Sienna, her expression conflicted and filled with sadness. And finally she saw Edric and Leora, standing together, their hands intertwined, watching her with a mixture of disappointment and something deeper, a kind of resigned understanding. Mira's legs felt like lead as she followed the officers down the aisle, the walk of shame. No one said a word, but their stares spoke volumes. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the murmur of passengers behind her faded, but the weight in her chest only grew heavier. She was no longer a respected senior flight attendant. She was now the cautionary tale. Back on the plane, Edric and Leora sat back down. The silence remained, but it was different now, heavier, filled with reflection. Sienna approached them cautiously, her hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry," she whispered, "for what happened, for not saying anything sooner." Leora smiled softly. "It's not your fault, dear. But I hope you learned something from this." Sienna nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I did." Edric's voice was calm. "The question is, what will you do with that lesson?" The terminal was buzzing with the usual chaos. Passengers rushing to their gates, families reuniting, announcements echoing over the intercom. But for Mira Rowan, the noise faded into a low hum. Her world had shrunk to the sterile hallway she now walked through, flanked by two security officers. Her steps felt heavy, each one dragging her closer to what she knew was coming. The disciplinary board. The once proud senior flight attendant now felt stripped bare, exposed in the harsh airport lighting, her uniform feeling like a costume she no longer deserved to wear. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How did it get this far? How did a simple glass of water lead to this? But deep down she knew it wasn't just about the water. It never was. They arrived at a glass-walled conference room, tucked away from the main terminal traffic. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a long table where several executives already sat. Their expressions were unreadable, cold, distant. At the head of the table sat Edric Whitmore, dressed impeccably, his face a mask of calm authority. Beside him was Leora, her elegance undiminished, her gaze softer but no less discerning. Mira's heart thudded painfully in her chest. This was it. The security officers left her at the door, closing it behind her with a soft but definitive click. She was alone now, standing before the very people whose simple request she had dismissed hours earlier. "Ms. Rowan?" Edric's voice broke the silence, deep and calm. "Please, have a seat." Mira hesitated, then obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him. Her hands trembled as she placed them on her lap, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. For a moment no one spoke. The silence stretched thin, taut, like a wire ready to snap. Finally, Edric spoke again. "Do you know why you're here?" Mira's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to answer. "Yes, sir. Because of how I treated you and your wife." Edric's expression didn't change. "Because of how you treated us? Or because of who we are?" The question cut deep. There was no good answer, and Mira knew it. Her lips trembled as she struggled to form a response. I didn't know who you were," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Leora leaned forward, her hands clasped gracefully. "And if we hadn't been the owners? If we were just any elderly couple? Would you have treated us the same way?" The question lingered in the room like a thick fog. Mira's shoulders sagged under the weight of it. I don't know," she admitted, tears threatening to spill. "I didn't think so. I made a judgment." Edric's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in profound disappointment. "Exactly. You made a judgment. Without knowing us. Without even considering why we might be there. You saw us and decided we didn't belong." Mira's chest tightened painfully. The truth was undeniable, and hearing it spoken aloud, especially by the very people she had wronged, made it feel all the more damning. Leora's voice softened, but there was steel beneath her calm demeanor. "It wasn't about the water, Ms. Rowan. It was about the ease with which you dismissed us. The way you decided, in a split second, that our needs didn't matter." Mira's tears finally broke free, slipping down her cheeks. She had spent years perfecting her professional facade, priding herself on her authority and control, but now all of that had crumbled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I truly am." Edric let out a slow exhale, his gaze steady. "I believe you're sorry, but that doesn't change what happened, or what it represents." He gestured toward the executives seated around the table. "This isn't just about you. It's about the culture that allowed this to happen. The silent rules, the unspoken biases. We've seen it too many times. And it ends." The executives exchanged glances, but no one spoke. The gravity of Edric's words filled the room. James Caldwell, the Vice President of Operations, finally broke the silence. "Mr. Rowan, after reviewing the incident and considering your conduct, we've come to a decision." Mira's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment she'd been dreading. "Effective immediately, your employment with Whitmore Airlines is terminated." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Mira's vision blurred as fresh tears welled in her eyes. She had known this was coming, had braced for it, but hearing it aloud made it all too real. Please," she choked out, desperation creeping into her voice. "Isn't there any way I can make this right? I didn't mean—" Edric raised a hand, stopping her. "It's not about meaning well. It's about actions, about choices. You made a choice, Ms. Rowan, and now we're making ours." The finality in his voice was inescapable. Leora stood gracefully, her gaze softening just slightly. "I hope you take this as a lesson, not just about your actions today, but about how you see people, about the judgments you make without even realizing it." Her words weren't cruel, they were honest, and that honesty hurt more than anything else. Mira sat frozen as Edric, Leora, and the executives stood, gathering their papers and belongings. No one looked at her as they filed out of the room. The door closed behind them with a soft but definitive click, leaving Mira alone in the sterile conference room, her sobs echoing against the walls. In the following days, the incident spread beyond the walls of the aeroplane and the boardroom. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange shared their stories on social media. Articles surfaced about the incident, highlighting not just Mira's actions but the broader implications. Silent biases in customer service. Systemic issues that often went unnoticed but caused deep harm. Whitmore Airlines released a public statement. "We at Whitmore Airlines are committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. We recognize that unconscious biases can influence behavior in ways that harm others, and we are taking steps to ensure this never happens again. Effective immediately, we are implementing mandatory bias training for all staff and revising our first-class service policies to prioritize empathy and fairness." The public reaction was mixed. Some praised the airline's swift action, while others debated whether Mira's termination was too harsh. But one thing was clear: a conversation had started. And conversations lead to change. For Mira, the days following her termination were filled with painful reflection. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the way she had dismissed Edric's simple request, the judgment that had clouded her thoughts without her even realizing it. It wasn't about the water, it never had been. It was about how easily she had made a choice based on assumptions, how quickly she had decided someone's worth without knowing a single thing about them. And now she was paying the price. She knew she couldn't undo what had happened, but she also knew she had a choice moving forward. A choice to confront her biases, to grow, and maybe, eventually, to find a way to make amends. The incident aboard Flight 472 reverberated far beyond the confines of the aircraft. What began as a simple request for a glass of water had now spiraled into a public reckoning, not just for Mira Rowan, but for Whitmore Airlines and the industry at large. By the time Mira left the airport that day, her name was already trending on social media. First-class bias, Whitmore scandal, glass of Watergate. The internet, as it often does, latched onto the story, dissecting every detail, every whisper that had floated through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had been on the flight posted their accounts on social media. Some expressed outrage at Mira's behavior, while others shared their discomfort at having witnessed the incident without speaking up. One tweet in particular went viral. Watched a flight attendant refuse water to an elderly black couple in first class today. Turns out they own the airline. Karma served colder than the water she refused. First class. The tweet racked up thousands of likes and retweets within hours. News outlets picked up the story next. Headlines flashed across screens. Flight attendant dismisses airline owners mid-flight, faces immediate termination. Silent bias in the skies, Whitmore Airlines under fire after viral incident. A glass of water, a career destroyed. Inside the scandal that shook Whitmore Airlines. For Mira Rowan, the fallout was immediate and brutal. She had hoped, foolishly, that the incident would remain contained, that perhaps it would be handled quietly within the airline, a termination, a non-disclosure agreement, and then silence. But in the age of social media, nothing stayed hidden for long. She sat alone in her small apartment, shades drawn tight, scrolling through endless posts about herself. The comments were ruthless. This is what unchecked bias looks like. Good riddance. She got what she deserved. I bet she never treated rich white passengers that way. Another example of people in power thinking they can get away with anything. But the worst were the videos. Snippets filmed by passengers during the flight. Footage of her being escorted off the plane by security, her face pale, her posture rigid. Another clip caught part of Edric Whitmore's calm but powerful statement to the cabin. "You didn't need to know who we were, you just needed to treat us like people." Hearing it again through the lens of a shaky phone video broke Mira all over again. Her phone buzzed non-stop, calls from unknown numbers, texts from former colleagues, some offering sympathy, others distancing themselves quickly. "Sorry, Mira, but the company wants nothing to do with this. It's a PR nightmare. You should lay low for a while, this is blowing up everywhere." What were you thinking? The shame was suffocating. She hadn't left her apartment in 2 days. The blinds stayed closed and the TV remained off, but the internet was relentless. Across the city, in a penthouse suite overlooking Central Park, Edric and Leora Whitmore sat quietly together, the chaos of the world outside not penetrating the calm they cultivated within. Edric scrolled through some of the headlines on his tablet, sighing deeply. "Look at this," he murmured, showing Leora an article. She glanced over the top of her reading glasses. The headline read, "Did Whitmore Airlines go too far? Debate over firing flight attendants heats up." Leora sighed, setting her tea down. "They always want a villain and a victim. Simple stories. This isn't simple." Edric nodded. "No, it's not." A beat of silence passed between them. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He thought for a moment before answering. "No." She needed to be held accountable, but "I didn't want this level of public humiliation." Leora reached for his hand. "We didn't do this to destroy her life. We did it to make a point. To the company, to the industry." And now the world has turned it into a spectacle, Edric finished. They had both lived through the slow, often painful process of fighting against biases, both subtle and overt. Their wealth hadn't shielded them from it. If anything, it had made the moments when they were dismissed or judged feel even sharper. But Edric, ever the strategist, knew that change required more than private conversations. It needed public discourse. And that was exactly what they had now. While Mira faced personal backlash, Whitmore Airlines itself became the focus of broader scrutiny. Journalists and advocates began digging deeper, asking uncomfortable questions. How many other employees share Mira Rowan's silent biases? What training does Whitmore Airlines offer to prevent discrimination? Are first-class passengers treated differently based on how they look? The airline's PR team scrambled to release statements, but nothing seemed to quell the growing debate. Finally, Edric Whitmore himself made a public address, streamed live from the airline's headquarters. Dressed in a simple navy suit, standing at a podium with the company's logo behind him, Edric's presence was calm but commanding. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "In recent days, an incident aboard one of our flights has sparked an important conversation, one that is long overdue." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Whitmore Airlines prides itself on excellence, not just in service, but in how we treat every individual who boards our planes. And yet, we failed." A murmur rippled through the crowd of reporters. "We failed not just because of one flight attendant's poor judgment, but because we allowed a culture where silent biases could exist unchecked." He met the cameras directly. "This isn't just about a glass of water. It's about how easy it is to make snap judgments, how easy it is to see someone and decide without thought whether they belong." The speech was heartfelt, unpolished, but deeply genuine. He concluded, "We are taking immediate steps, not just by terminating the employee involved, but by examining our entire company culture. There will be mandatory bias training for all staff, stricter protocols, and more importantly, an ongoing dialogue about how we can do better." The broadcast ended, but the impact lingered. In the weeks that followed, the conversation expanded beyond just Whitmore Airlines. Talk shows debated the incident. Advocacy groups used it as a teaching moment. Hashtags like "silent bias" and "every passenger matters" trended for days. People shared their own stories, times they'd been dismissed or overlooked, not for what they said or did, but for how they looked. One post read, "I was once in business class on a flight and had a flight attendant assume I was sitting in the wrong seat. I had to show my ticket twice before they believed me. This Whitmore incident hits hard." Another, "It's not just airlines, it's restaurants, hotels, everywhere. Snap judgments happen all the time." What had started as a scandal had become something more, a cultural reckoning. For Mira, the world grew smaller by the day. She deactivated her social media accounts, shut off her phone, and tried to disappear. But she couldn't escape herself. Every night she replayed the moment in her mind. Edric asking for water, her refusal, the way she had dismissed him and Leora without a second thought. She had never seen herself as someone with biases. She had prided herself on professionalism, on maintaining standards. But now she saw the truth. Professionalism had become a mask she wore to justify her silent judgments. The hardest part wasn't the public backlash or the loss of her job. It was realizing how easily she had made that choice, how quickly she had decided who was worthy and who wasn't. And the worst realization of all? She had probably done it before, countless times. A few weeks after the incident, Mira received a letter in the mail, no return address, just her name written in elegant handwriting. Curious, she opened it. It was from Leora Whitmore. "Dear Miss Rowan, I imagine this has been a difficult time for you. I don't write this to scold or to shame. You've been through enough of that. I write because I want you to understand that this moment doesn't have to define you. It can break you, or it can be the beginning of something better. I hope you choose the latter. We all carry biases. The important thing is recognizing them and doing the hard work to unlearn them. It's not easy, but it's necessary. I wish you well on that journey. Sincerely, Leora Whitmore. Mira read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was something softer. A bridge, perhaps. An invitation to do better. She didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know if she could ever work in the airline industry again. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The incident aboard Flight 472 had stirred a storm that stretched far beyond Mira Rowan's personal disgrace or Whitmore Airlines' public relations crisis. In many ways, it had become a catalyst, a defining moment that forced a deeper look into the silent biases ingrained not just in customer service, but in society at large. But for the people at the heart of it, Mira, Edric, Leora, and even the airline itself, the dust had not yet settled. 3 weeks after Edric's public address, Whitmore Airlines held a press conference that would mark the beginning of its systemic overhaul. Edric stood at the podium again, flanked by Leora and the company's executive board. This time, however, the mood was less reactive and more resolute. "Today is not about damage control," Edric began, his voice firm but calm. "It's about accountability and, more importantly, change." He paused, allowing the room to quiet. "We have always prided ourselves on being an airline that treats every passenger with dignity. But this incident has shown us that intentions aren't enough. Systems must be in place to uphold those values consistently." He gestured to a large screen behind him, which displayed the words, "Operation Elevate, Redefining First-Class Service." The initiative was comprehensive. It included mandatory bias and empathy training. All staff, from executives to flight attendants, would undergo extensive training focused on recognizing and dismantling unconscious biases. Anonymous reporting systems. Passengers and crew would now have direct access to an anonymous platform to report incidents of discrimination or unfair treatment. Service protocol overhaul, the rules and guidelines that flight attendants followed, especially in first class, would be rewritten with a focus on empathy, fairness, and consistency. Customer inclusion panels. Regular meetings where passengers from diverse backgrounds could provide feedback directly to the airline's leadership. "This isn't about punishing one person or putting a band-aid on a larger issue," Edric continued. "It's about creating an environment where every person, regardless of how they look, where they're from, or how much they paid for their ticket, is treated with respect." The room erupted in applause, not just from reporters but from employees who had come to witness the announcement. Whitmore Airlines wasn't just surviving the scandal, it was growing from it. While the airline charted a new course, Mira Rowan was struggling to navigate her own. The days had grown monotonous, quiet, heavy, and often lonely. Without work to ground her or social media to distract her, Mira was left with nothing but her thoughts and regrets. She had applied for a few jobs, flight and otherwise, but the stigma of the incident followed her like a shadow. Most applications were met with silence. A few responses came with thinly veiled rejections. "We appreciate your interest, but we're moving forward with other candidates. Given recent events, we don't believe this would be the right fit." Each rejection chipped away at her already fragile confidence. But Leora's letter lingered in her mind. "This doesn't have to define you." Those words echoed in the silence of her apartment. They challenged her, haunted her even, but they also offered something she hadn't felt since the incident: a second chance. One rainy afternoon, Mira found herself walking into a community center downtown. She had seen an advertisement for a workshop on unconscious bias and empathy in customer service. She wasn't sure what compelled her to go. Curiosity? Guilt? Hope? The workshop was hosted by a non-profit focused on social justice and inclusivity. About 30 people filled the room: restaurant servers, hotel concierges, retail workers, and a few fellow flight attendants from other airlines. The speaker, a woman named Marisol, stood at the front with a warm, approachable demeanor. "Let's start with a simple exercise," she began. "Close your eyes. Picture someone in your mind who would sit in first class on a flight. What do they look like? How are they dressed? How old are they?" Mira's eyes fluttered shut. Without meaning to, an image formed. A white man in his 40s, wearing a tailored suit, an expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. Now, Marisol's voice continued, ask yourself why you pictured that person. What shaped that image in your mind? The question pierced through Mira's chest. She opened her eyes slowly, her throat tightening. She had never consciously thought of herself as biased. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her fairness, but the truth was undeniable. She had made snap judgments daily, all under the guise of experience and efficiency. After the session, Marisol approached her. I recognize you, she said gently, without malice. You're the flight attendant from the Whitmore incident, right? Mira's stomach sank. She nodded, preparing herself for another verbal lashing. But Marisol's face softened. I'm glad you're here. Mira blinked, caught off guard. You are? Of course. Most people in your position would hide, pretend it never happened. But you're here, learning. That's more than most would do. Tears welled in Mira's eyes. I didn't even realize I was doing it. Judging people like that. Marisol placed a hand on her shoulder. None of us do at first, but now you see it, and that's where change starts. Days turned into weeks, and Mila continued attending workshops, reading books on empathy and unconscious bias, and even volunteering at the community center. It wasn't penance, it was personal growth. One evening she sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of cold tea forgotten beside her, and began to write. Dear Edric and Leora Whitmore, I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to write it anyway. I've spent the last few months reflecting on what happened, on the choices I made that day aboard Flight 4172. At first I was angry, at myself, at the world, at how quickly everything fell apart, but now I see it for what it was, a moment that exposed not just my biases but my blind spots, my assumptions, my failure to see people as people. I want to thank you, not for what happened, but for how you handled it. You had every right to be furious, but you approached the situation with grace and dignity. I can only hope to learn from that. I'm working on myself now, not because I was forced to, but because I want to. Your words, especially Mrs. Whitmore's letter, stuck with me. This doesn't have to define you. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't. Thank you again. I hope someday I can truly make amends. Celia, Mira Rowan. She sealed the envelope, unsure if it would ever reach them, but feeling lighter for having written it. Months passed, and Whitmore Airlines began to see the fruits of its systemic changes. Flight attendants reported feeling more empowered to speak up against unfair treatment, both from passengers and colleagues. Passengers noticed subtle shifts, more consistency in service, warmer interactions, fewer moments where someone was quietly dismissed or overlooked. One notable change was the introduction of empathy leaders on flights, staff members specifically trained to handle sensitive situations, ensuring every passenger felt seen and valued. Edric and Leora, though still heavily involved in the company's operations, took a step back from the public eye, content to watch the transformation unfold from behind the scenes. One day, while reviewing some correspondence, Leora found Mira's letter. She read it carefully, feeling a mix of emotions, sadness, hope, and a sense of closure. She's trying, Leora said softly, handing the letter to Edric. He read it, his face unreadable at first, but then he smiled, a rare, genuine smile. Good, he said. Everyone deserves a second chance, if they're willing to do the work. 6 months later, Mira found herself standing in front of a classroom, not as a flight attendant, but as a speaker at a customer service workshop. The topic? Empathy in action, learning from mistakes. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice was strong. I'm not here today as an expert, she began. I'm here as someone who made a mistake. One that cost me my job, my reputation, and, for a while, my sense of self. But that mistake also taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Empathy isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small moments, the simple choices we make to see people as they are, not as we assume them to be. She scanned the room, seeing faces that reminded her of her past self, people who, like her, had probably made silent judgments without even realizing it. But the most important thing I've learned, she continued, is that we all have blind spots. What matters is whether we're willing to see them and whether we're brave enough to change. As the session ended, several attendees came up to thank her. One young woman, a new flight attendant, said, "I really appreciate you sharing your story. It made me think twice about how I treat people." Mira smiled, an honest, unguarded smile. It wasn't redemption, not fully, but it was a start. The echoes of her past still haunted her, but Mira Rowan had made it this far. After months of reflection, growth, and self-imposed exile, she found herself back where everything had unraveled, in the towering glass building of Whitmore Airline's corporate headquarters. This time, though, she wasn't escorted by security. She had walked in of her own volition, invited for what Edric Whitmore had called a final conversation. No promises, no guarantees, just a conversation. Mira stood outside the boardroom, her heart hammering in her chest. The weight of the invitation had been both a burden and a glimmer of hope, an opportunity to finally close the chapter that had defined her life for so long. She inhaled deeply, adjusted the simple blazer she wore, not a uniform but her own clothes this time, and pushed the door open. The boardroom was nearly identical to the one where she had faced her termination months ago. The same long table, the same high-backed chairs, the same sterile feel. But today it felt different. Less hostile, perhaps. Less final. Seated at the head of the table was Edric Whitmore, his calm but authoritative presence filling the space. Leora sat beside him, graceful as always, her hands folded neatly on the table. Around them were a few executives, some familiar faces from the day Mira was fired, others she didn't recognize. No one spoke as she entered. The silence was deafening, but Mira welcomed it. It gave her a moment to gather her thoughts. "Ms. Rowan," Edric began, gesturing toward a chair across from him. "Thank you for coming." Mira took the seat, her back straight, but her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. "I wasn't sure if she admitted, but I felt like I needed to." Leora nodded softly. "Sometimes the hardest step is showing up." A beat passed before Edric leaned forward, folding his hands. "This isn't a trial, Miss Rowan. We're not here to pass judgment again. You've already faced that." Mira swallowed the lump in her throat. "Then why am I here?" "Because you've been doing the work," Leora interjected gently. "We've been following, not to intrude, but to see if your journey was genuine." Mira's eyes widened in surprise. "You? You knew?" Edric's face softened slightly. "We saw the workshops. We read your letter. We know about the speaking engagements." The thought that they had been aware of her efforts all along sent a strange mix of emotions through Mira. Embarrassment, pride, and something like relief. "I didn't do it for show," she whispered. "I needed to change. I needed to face what I had done." Edric leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "That's why you're here. We wanted to hear it directly from you, not through reports or letters. From you." Mira took a shaky breath. This was it, her chance to speak her truth. "I spent years on those flights, moving through first-class cabins thinking I was just doing my job," she began. "I thought professionalism meant efficiency, control, keeping things orderly. But somewhere along the way I stopped seeing people as people." Deeb interrupted. She met Edric's gaze directly. "I didn't realize it. Not until that flight. Not until I saw how easily I dismissed you and your wife. Without thought. Without empathy." Her voice quavered, but she pushed forward. "And it wasn't just that moment. I see that now. It was all the little moments before it. The passengers I dismissed without realizing, the silent biases I let guide my decisions." Leora's eyes glistened slightly, but she remained composed. "What made you realize that?" Mira hesitated. "Your letter," she admitted, looking at Leora. "The one you sent me after everything. You said, 'This doesn't have to define you.' At first I thought there was no way to come back from it, but your words, they gave me permission to try." A soft, understanding smile touched Leora's lips. Edric, however, was not yet finished. You've done a lot of self-reflection, that much is clear. But let me ask you this, Ms. Rowan. If you had never found out who we were, if you had never been exposed, would you have seen the problem? The question hit hard. Mira didn't shy away. No, she admitted, her voice heavy. I wouldn't have. That's what scares me the most, that it took something so public, so humiliating, for me to see it. Edric nodded slowly. Awareness often comes with a price, but the real test is what you do after. Mira felt the truth in his words. She had paid the price, with her career, her reputation, her sense of self, but she had chosen to rebuild, not to wallow. I want to help others avoid making the same mistakes I did, she said, her voice stronger now. To see the biases before they become actions, to see people before making judgments. Elora leaned forward, her tone soft but resolute. And that's why you're here. We wanted to see if you understood the depth of the harm caused, not just to us, but to everyone you dismissed without realizing it. Miro's eyes burned with tears. I do. And I'll carry that with me forever. A long silence followed. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was reflective. Finally, Edric spoke. We're not here to offer you your job back, he said plainly. This isn't about restoring your old life. Mira nodded, expecting as much. But we are prepared to offer you something else, a chance to use what you've learned. Mira blinked in confusion. I don't understand. Leora smiled gently. We're launching a new program, a partnership between Whitmore Airlines and several advocacy groups, aimed at improving empathy in customer service industries, workshops, speaking engagements, real-world training. Edric continued, We'd like you to be one of the lead trainers, to share your story, the mistakes, the fallout, the growth, to help others see their own blind spots before it's too late. Mira's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She wasn't even sure she deserved it. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say yes, Leora said gently, not as a redemption arc, not as a second chance at your old life, but as a responsibility, one that comes from truly understanding the harm caused and the potential for change. Tears slipped down Mira's cheeks, but this time they weren't just tears of shame. They were mixed with gratitude, hope, and something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. I would be honored, she whispered. Months later, Mira stood in front of a packed auditorium, a group of flight attendants, hotel staff, restaurant servers, and corporate employees seated before her. She took a deep breath and began. My name is Mira Rowan, and I'm here because I made a mistake, one that cost me everything I thought defined me. She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. But it also gave me something I didn't know I needed, the chance to see myself clearly, flaws and all, and to do something better. The audience listened, some nodding, others jotting down notes, but all engaged. Mira's journey hadn't led her back to the sky, to the aisles of first-class cabins. It had led her somewhere deeper, into the complex, uncomfortable spaces where biases live and grow. And it was there that she found her new calling, helping others confront those spaces before they spilled out into the world as harm. One evening, after leading a workshop, Mira found herself at a small cafe near the community center. She sipped her coffee, reflecting on the journey. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Leora. Saw the photos from today's workshop. You're doing important work. We're proud of you. Mira smiled, her heart full. She thought back to the flight that had changed everything, the glass of water refused, the silent biases exposed, the humiliation that had felt like the end of her world. But now she saw it differently. It hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. A landing that had brought her to a new path, one not defined by status, uniforms, or silent judgments, but by growth, empathy, and the hard, ongoing work of change. And in that she found something more valuable than any first-class ticket. She found herself